Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a la conferencia plenaria del día de hoy. Como parte de RedLab, quisiera agradecer su participación en la conferencia que se está llevando a cabo estos días. Tengo el placer de presentar a la plenaria del día de hoy. Y antes de hacer las introducciones pertinentes, me gustaría hacer un comentario sobre el tema que nuestra ponente va a presentar. Como lingüistas y analistas del lenguaje, estamos acostumbrados y hasta quizás militamos un poco con la idea de que el lenguaje crea realidades. Desde la semiótica social sabemos que efectivamente tanto nuestra cultura como el contexto, y así como nuestras experiencias, interacciones y procesos cognitivos, están íntimamente relacionados con la interpretación y la creación de nuevos significados. En este sentido, la tecnología particularmente ha forjado y nos ha permitido un poco explorar distintas modalidades de comunicación que son apropiadas y resignificadas en distintas comunidades de práctica. Sin ir más lejos, estoy segura que todos, todas y todos hemos tenido algún chat en donde imágenes, sonidos e iconos como los emojis significan la conversación, agregando más o menos un poco de informalidad a la relación interpersonal que estamos creando. Esta democratización del significado nos presenta con nuevos desafíos, tanto en nuestra práctica profesional como en nuestra faceta de investigadores e investigadoras de la multimodalidad. En cierto modo, nos desafía, ¿cierto? Nos desafía a posicionarnos dentro de un espectro transformador, asumiendo no solo el rol de analista o investigador o lingüista, sino que también como un activista multimodal. Este es precisamente el tema que abordará nuestra invitada, la doctora María Grazia Sindoni, de la Università degli Studi di Messina, en Italia. En su presentación titulada De analista multimodal a activista multimodal, la práctica transformadora de aprender, enseñar y autoevaluar las multialfabetizaciones en contextos desafiantes, la doctora va a argumenta a través de su presentación que nuestro trabajo como analistas multimodales no puede considerarse solamente una práctica neutral, precisamente por esta negociación continua de nuestras identidades en relación a las posturas personales, sociales y también culturales de nosotros y de otras personas. Es a través de 3 estudios de caso que la doctora Sindoni describe algunas direcciones que un investigador multimodal puede tomar para convertirse en un activista multimodal. Doctora Sindoni, es un placer tenerla en esta 10ª edición de ICOM.
Let me start my talk by setting the scene and introducing myself. You may wonder why this is relevant, but background information will frame my call for activism, at least in the challenging contexts I'll be discussing today. My talk invites you to think of transformation as a wake-up call as regards becoming a multimodal activist, where activism is a way of exercising agency on one's own terms and being rooted in one's own contexts. I'll begin from my own life trajectory that has helped me shape my stance and position as a researcher living and working in a challenging context, namely Sicily. So I'll talk about my personal transformation, and I'll do so by showing you a clip from a movie where a child is told by his father that the mafia kills only in summer, implying that the mafia is a circumscribed phenomenon with mafiosi only killing each other. As the story unfolds, the child in question wakes up to the ugly truth of mafia choking and stifling all aspects of Sicilian life in a deadly embrace. Mafia only kills in summer used to be a very common refrain and a widely shared belief, both when I was a child and then a teenager.
Papà, ma la mafia è pericolosa.
No, è come coi cani, basta che non gli dai fastidio.
Ma io ho letto che uccide le persone.
Cose che scrivono.
Ma può uccidere anche noi.
Arturo, tranquillo. Ora siamo d'inverno, la mafia uccide solo d'estate. Ora dormi.
The rude awakening from this reassuring picture of the mafia as something that did and could not involve me, my family and friends in any possible way was indeed shocking. The last mafia war took place in the 80s and early 90s with some 10,000 people killed in the streets of Palermo. Sicily entered a stage that was labeled by the historians and media as stragismo or mafia-linked terrorism, where a strategy of tension was pursued as a consequence of the life sentences handed down during the Maxi trial, as well as the result of new anti-mafia measures launched by the government. In 1992, two anti-mafia judges, Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, were killed in two major dynamite attacks. Commentators compared the Sicilians' reaction to that at the killing of John Fitzgerald Kennedy in the 60s in the US and even 9/11. The next clip provides more context and is followed by a short extract of people's reactions at Falcone's funeral.
These are the prison cells where the criminals were held during the trial. Over 8,500 documents were collected and used in evidence. The trial lasted about a year and a half and is considered to be the biggest trial held in the world. After the trial, Falcone and Borsellino would continue their crusade despite political opposition and uncertainty in Sicily and Italy. Like many other heroic mafia fighters before them, the inevitable happened. On May 23, 1992, Judge Falcone, his wife Francesca Morvillo, also a magistrate, and 3 police escorts were on their way from the airport to visit family in Palermo when a half a ton of remotely detonated explosives hidden under the road ripped through the highway, killing all of them. The blast was so powerful that it registered as a small earthquake. Over 1/4 mile of the highway was cratered. The citizens of Sicily and Italy were out.
Vergogna, vergogna. Sono questi studenti e la gente, sono i colleghi di Antonio, Vito, Rocco, buffoni. A stento riescono a trattenere la gente.
I was among that crowd, and that was my moment of awakening. And at the time, I decided to become a teacher and a researcher in no other place than my island, Sicily. I would like now to invite you to think about your own awakenings when you started seeing the world with different eyes and were somehow separated from your childhood. I argue that tracing one's memory back to that moment of transformation will help locate and mobilize resources for the establishment of a socially oriented agenda of transformation vis-à-vis activism. I'd like you to bear this context in mind as it frames the research directions I'll be presenting today. My talk is divided in the following parts. First, I'll talk about my idea of learning as transformation, and I'll do so by presenting the You Made for All project, in particular focusing on one of its outputs, the Common Framework of Reference for Intercultural Digital Literacies. Then I'll talk about 2 follows-up with talking about transformation as empowerment in a project of collaborative translation of the framework into Italian. And the last case studies I'll be discussing is the adoption of the framework for Sicilian women detained in maximum security prisons. Consistent with this prelude, I argue that learning does not take place merely in educational settings, but is instead an ongoing process transforming intersubjectivity over time. This transformation is in fact made possible by the activation and mobilization of interpersonal, emotive, cognitive, and cultural resources that all human beings experience. Personal awakenings, like those I showed you at the beginning, may be more or less dramatic, but I argue that they can be seen as fractures that trigger rebirth and growth. In this light, learning is much more than a task-based, content-oriented, and metrics-established process that takes place in school and in other places of formal instruction. Learning is interwoven in the fabric of life and goes well beyond an idea of neoliberalist education as a goal-oriented process designed to achieve a position in society and therefore bounded by a clear-cut beginning and end. A normative approach to academic practices rests on the educational myths that Kress describes as the homogeneity of the student population, but what happens when students do not come from affluent backgrounds, for example, when they're outside of academia. Second, the stability of disciplines, but what happens when you can, or what you can do when the main learning goal falls beyond disciplines. And third, the unidirectionality of the teacher-students relation. But here, the two questions could be, what do students teach us and what can students teach each other? So a multimodal transformative approach encourages us to explore the potential for transformation in education and is concerned instead with locating conventions of specific knowledge making in specific traditions. And these traditions of meaning making as well may in fact resist, and for several reasons, the idea that English is the only language for communication. I argue that English is not the only possible language for intercultural communication, and that the promotion of local languages runs parallel to empowering processes, especially in areas that struggle to decolonize from the English language, both culturally and materially. Then eliciting the perspective of students, therefore documenting the learning process as transformation, but I'll be talking about this later in the second case study, and then exploring alternative ways of meaning making when learning is first and foremost seen as an imaginative practice that can change one's future. And you will see in the case of women prisoners in Sicilian maximum security wings. So let me introduce the You Made for All project, European Multimodal and Digital Education for Language Learning. The project I'll present was not designed in a vacuum. It all started as 4 Italian researchers joined forces without funding and on a voluntary basis, and together designed and planned a 1-year project, Multimodality on the Move, shortened as MOM. We experimented a truly peer academic work, as we had no leaders, no senior scholars involved, no admin support, no external formal guidance. The project took shape as a set of extra voluntary activities that we organized in 4 different universities in Italy to promote an idea of university outside the traditional academic hierarchies, and where this form of activism was an antidote to the disciplined regimes of academia. To this end, we developed a module to teach and learn 4 digital texts from a multimodal perspective. The milestone of this homespan project was the ideological position of moving the teacher from center stage in the assessment phase so as to locate students on stage and have them evaluate their peers on commonly agreed criteria. I'm not saying this to romanticize the project, but rather to emphasize that transformation should begin with oneself, and that practicing peer teaching and peer research can make peer assessment and peer learning truly credible. The result of the internationalization of the MOM project is the You Made for All project. You see here the strand where the 3-year project was financed for a little less than €500,000, as well as the composition of the research units and their leaders. In the project, we had altogether 5 universities, including all 4 founding members of the MOM group, a tech research center which designs and develops platforms for e-learning, and a British web agency. The rationale behind the project was to integrate 3 different milestones, which were multimodality as a way to promote multiliteracies with English as the language of international communication. And we did so by mobilizing students' repertoire of resources, getting them to learn how to plan, design, and produce their own texts, rather than studying what other people had done. Then analyzing these texts as a meta-reflective process and interpreting what other students had done in the same context. And finally, evaluating and assessing the whole process as a formative training of walking in other students' shoes. With reference to the educational practices that we adopted, we designed a joint syllabus that involved some 250 students, the 5 university unit leaders as the teachers in all classes, and we all had to evaluate and assess by using common criteria, thus promoting a practice where assessment was a combination of teachers and students' peer assessment, where the latter was crucially formally incorporated in the final mark. These ideas were then organically organized into 4 distinct stages. In the first, a core session was taught by the 5 teachers in each home university, covering topics of multimodality, digital literacies, using English as the language of communication. In the second phase, that of traveling workshops, which we adopted from the MOM project and in a pre-COVID situation, we had theoretical and practical sessions on the 5 digital texts: blogs, promotional videos, fan vids, web pages, and video interactions delivered by the 5 teachers. So we basically replicated the 5-week module in each university so that students were taught the same module in their home university. In phase 3, students produced a text of their choice among the 5 and a short analysis that motivated their choices, and then anonymously peer assessed another student with random matching done by the UMate4All platform. The last phase had the best 50 achieving students meeting in Aarhus in Denmark for a workshop on social media management and a hands-on crisis management workshop held by web professionals and specialists. Here you see some examples of texts produced by students, where you can also see how the meta-reflective component is prioritized. The digital text in itself, be it a fan vid or a video-mediated communication, is not so important as the transcription task that reflects, for example, students' media ideologies and their way of making sense of the produced digital text or interaction. For fan vids, you see here the units of analysis included, for example, image, phase, speech, music, ambient sound, sound perspective, transition, frames, and captions. Whereas for video-mediated interactions, units of analysis included speech, writing, social distance, mode switching, kinesics, gaze, and setting. The same can be said about the mock-ups, where web pages or blogs were not evaluated as blueprints reflecting some ready-made ideas of what is good or what is bad, what is more or less professional, but were observed and then assessed in the layout customization process. And the process of personalizing contents was pedagogically useful to allow agency and subjectivity emerge out of the homogeneity of templates and pre-established formats. You see here some more examples that mirrors students' understanding of the different components of the About Us web page. This is the peer assessment grid that shows how each question under the same general criterion was guided. For example, for multimodal orchestration, the question to focus on was, is the combined use of all semiotic resources of the text suitable to its communicative purposes? Then the students had grades from A to F, and then they had to motivate their answers. So basically we tried to also evaluate the consistency between grade and motivation for the grade. And here you see qualitative feedback, which was a free space where students had the chance to write their qualitative and constructive feedback. This is the teacher's assessment form that actually, as you can see, replicates the peer assessment grid, but with the addition of another section that evaluated how well the peer assessment task was developed by the students. And here the criteria were argumentation, consistency, and constructive feedback. All the data were used to develop the framework of reference for intercultural digital literacies, a comprehensive set of guidelines to describe levels of proficiency in abilities needed in digital scenarios. Our framework is an integration and an expansion of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, the Digital Competence Framework for Citizens, and the Autobiography of Intercultural Encounters, with our descriptors integrating language, digital and intercultural components into an underlying multimodal and sociosemiotic framework for a pedagogy of multiliteracies. A CEFRIDIL, the acronym for the framework, is a data-driven model that has been designed and developed by using data from the students' baseline evaluation surveys, students' productions and course evaluations, teacher assessment and student peer assessment, and grounding it on qualitative insights and quantitative data, for example, with studies of correlations between items from different surveys and analysis per item, per text type, and per course. Methodologically, we combined a bottom-up and a top-down approach, starting from raw data, for example, peer assessment comments, student submissions, analysis, teachers and peers' feedback and grades, to derive text-specific descriptors, and then designed more abstract and general descriptors. Then we compared materials from relevant research literature, existing frameworks, and syllabus material, with the aim of integrating the general descriptors and then to refine, fine-tune, and further pin down text-specific descriptors. You see here the general structure of the framework. Section 1 introduces the 3 dimensions of multimodal orchestration, digital technologies, and intercultural communication. These reflect data and insights derived from the 3 general and common to all criteria for assessment and peer assessment, irrespective of text type. So the first part of the grid that was not focused on a specific text type, but general and common to all. And a fourth, all-encompassing dimension called transversal skills that describes the personal repertoire of social skills, such as team building, coping with anxiety, empathizing with others, and other interpersonal abilities that facilitate group work. All dimensions are subgrouped into macro categories and then in task-based and context-dependent descriptors, which explain which skills are needed in real-life situations, mostly in digital contexts. Section 2 includes all general descriptors, but with examples from specific text types that were studied during the joint interacademic syllabus. And section 3 presents the 3 different levels of mastery: proficient, intermediate, and way stage. You see here the dimensions with related macro categories. So we have for multimodal orchestration, selecting and combining multiple meaning-making resources to serve the communicative purposes of the digital text or online communication, establishing effective interactions and self-representation, understanding, interpreting, and critically evaluating multimodal text production, interacting with a digital text. Whereas under digital technologies, we have the macro categories of pre-production and while production participation stage, understanding and interacting with digital texts, and meta-reflection. Within the intercultural communication dimensions, we have attitudes and feelings, understanding and awareness, action and behavior. Whereas for the last dimension, transversal skills, the 3 macro categories include managing context, collaboration and information, managing change and uncertainty, managing one's and others' emotion. So this is an extract from section 1 with the 3 dimensions of multimodal orchestration, digital technologies, and intercultural communication, with questions that guide understanding and interpretation of the dimensions. So we have, how do I make meanings in digital environments for multimodal orchestration? How do I use the tools of digital environments for digital technologies? How do I make meanings with others in digital environments? Then you can see the 3 macro categories, selecting and combining multiple resources to serve the communicative purposes of the digital text or online communication, with a general descriptor can purposefully select out of the available meaning-making resources such as images, spoken and written language, music, gesture, typography, color, and combine them to structure a digital text or online interaction that successfully communicates messages to its intended audiences or addresses. In the macro category of pre-production participation stage within the digital technologies dimension, we can navigate online sources of information purposefully to serve the purposes of the digital text or online communication. And under attitudes and feelings in the intercultural communication dimension, another example of a general descriptor shows empathy towards others' feelings and thoughts while interacting with a digital text or participating in online communication. This is the first extract from section 2. Within multimodal orchestration. And in this example here, you see 2 distinct text-specific examples under the same macro category, selecting and combining multiple resources to serve the communicative purposes of the digital text or online communication, but under 2 different general descriptors. So the first can purposefully select out of the available meaning-making resources and combine them to structure a digital text or online interaction. The text-specific example is when participating in video-mediated interaction, I can combine available resources such as speech, writing input in the chat box, gestures, gaze, distance from the screen, emoticons, emojis, and files to have a meaningful conversation in both informal and formal contexts. Whereas under the general descriptor can complement different resources, for example, writing and images through adding, repeating, and so on, The text-specific descriptor here is when producing a promotional video, I can use written spoken language to complement visuals. For instance, I can use a superimposed writing and or voiceover together with the visual to clarify or add emphasis. I can fit music and or lyrics to the visual and the verbal, for example, superimposed text, in tune with the context and the intended audience. I can show emotions, attitudes, visually and verbally to serve the communicative purposes of the video. The second extract from section 2 reports on some general examples of the transversal skills dimension under the macro category of managing context, collaboration, and information. With the general descriptor can take decisions in relation to the demands of context. And here you see in the blue box other examples of descriptors can do statements, but these do not refer to text in particular, but are again general. For example, can rapidly take on an unexpected new situation and engage with the deriving demands. For example, reprioritize tasks in tune with the context, can understand relevance of demands and required activities, responses in relation to the unexpected new situation autonomously and promptly without being provided with any proper introduction, framing, explanation, and training, can assess rapidly and autonomously reactions and needs of different audiences and can respond accordingly, can adjust rapidly and efficiently to change and uncertainty. Another general descriptor can collaborate effectively and can be an effective team member. So here the can-do statements, the general can-do statements can easily and rapidly identify individual skills and distribute roles and tasks to optimize teamwork according to this, can express opinions and disagreement in a constructive way without causing obstacles, difficulties, conflicts, or frustration, both to self and others, can provide constructive feedback that stimulates improvement of individual performances and strengthens teamwork dynamics, can manage own and others' emotions and behaviors and respond constructively, and so on. So here, you see a slide produced by one of the project partners, Mark Rocca, and presents a different visualization of the transversal skills to show you here the complexity of these skills and their networked interconnections. The first extract from section 3 presents the 3 different levels of proficient, intermediate, and way stage. And here I'd like to draw your attention to the modifiers we used to distinguish between the levels. For example, can completely assess the kind of information that needs to be gathered and search for data and information which are relevant to the content of the digital text or online communication effectively. For the intermediate level, can assess most of the information, and for the way stage level, can identify some of the information quite effectively. Second example, can navigate online sources of information purposefully and effectively. Intermediate, purposefully, though may not always do it effectively. Way stage, with some difficulty and sometimes unsuccessfully. Third example, can develop highly effective search strategies after having specified one's information needs, can develop a number of effective search strategies, can develop a limited number of effective search strategies. Here, another example for the intercultural communication, the different levels. Again, showing you the modifiers. These, in our opinion, can be useful for both assessment, so in educational context, but also for professional contexts and for self-assessment. So shows a great openness to, interest in, and curiosity for diversity through different resources such as language, gaze, gestures, without applying prejudgments on the other's representation, expression, and behavior while interacting with a digital text or participating in online communication. Shows an adequate degree of openness, shows some degree of openness, shows a high degree of empathy towards others' feelings and thoughts, shows empathy towards others' feelings, though may not always be able to do it throughout, show empathy towards others, though with some difficulties. So the CEFRI deal, the framework, was not the product of a single person, but the result of the joint efforts of many people involved in this project. But now the CEFRI deal has started circulating and developing a life of its own. As one of the many follows up, I'm currently working on translation, as in my experience, English is still an elite language in many contexts, including my own. You may wonder where you could start, and my answer is where you belong. Speaking of intercultural communication, when the only language used is English, brings along a paradoxical situation, also serious shortcomings, and the only alternative is the enhancement and promotion of local languages. English and other languages are not mutually exclusive, but I argue that English should not supersede intercultural communication in other languages, as the intercultural component may be internal to local languages and varieties, for example, in diglossic contexts, with the goal of promoting more comprehensive forms of intercultural communication and thus making the framework available to an Italian audience. I involved these young ladies for women trainee translators in a collaborative experiment to translate into Italian the framework. Given that this was a multimodal translation, particular care was spent in reproducing the same format for all sections and components of the framework. The translation was not merely limited to the actual framework with the 3 sections I showed you, but to other additional components, such as downloadable forms with baseline surveys, final evaluation for the text types, peer assessment forms, as well as quantitative data, statistics, and correlations, as well as qualitative extracts, guidelines for assessment, and another fundamental part of the framework, that is the glossary, which accounts for the theoretical rationale that we followed in shaping our framework. Working collaboratively was developed with traditional methods used to encourage meta-reflection, such as think aloud protocols and a diary to document the process of translation. The framework contents were not simply dealt with as distant objects of contemplation, but rather reading and translating the framework became experiential appropriation and transformative practice in itself. The CEFRI deal is a multimodal text that was to be resemiotized into Italian, as well as a pedagogical tool to be adopted in the process. For example, the translators reported in their diaries the beneficial effects of experiencing the transversal skill descriptors while they were collaborating, thus encouraging them to improve the level of their communicative skills. The integration of translation tasks with what the framework had to say in their lives was a step towards the recognition of their own agency. As another follow-up, I'm returning to the middle of that crowd that I showed you at the beginning, in a regional Sicilian project where the Italian translation of the framework is used in a simplified version for Sicilian women detained in maximum security wings in Sicilian prisons. As these women dropped out of school very early on and come from mafia-linked families, a mixed code of Italian and Sicilian will be used to teach how to adopt very basic descriptors and can-do statements to gauge intercultural digital literacies. But this is an idea, a very different idea of intercultural communication. On a practical level, this will be a way to provide them with basic digital skills, while the intercultural component attempts to connect or reconnect their experience to a context other than that of crime by means of their local language. On a wider pedagogical level, this will be a way to encourage empowerment in vulnerable individuals and help them see and imagine a different life trajectory using the power of imagination as life transforming. A multimodal transformative approach will bring at last three effects: a focus on all resources for communication, including nonverbal and not necessarily language, will help Sicilian women to overcome the language barriers and resist the social stigma attached to non-standard Italian speakers. In a translanguaging perspective, all languages are in fact equally meaning-making. And as they are much more proficient than I am in speaking Sicilian regional varieties, will be all learners and all teachers at the same time. Future directions will involve other translations. The French and Japanese translations are on the way, but I hope that the number of other languages will increase in the near future. By way of conclusion, allow me to go back to Arturo, a child who, like me and many others of my generation in Sicily, was persuaded early on in life that the mafia kills only in summer, to discover a little later on that closing his eyes was not sufficient to avoid being involved in his social context. Awakenings are the most important moments of learning, and awakenings bring rebirth, transformation, and growth. All of us, researchers and teachers, can work as multimodal analysts and stay safe in our closed and protected environments, but we can also accept the challenge to take the less traveled road and become multimodal activists. Thank you.